Well, good morning, everyone. I'm so glad that you joined us today. If you're in our common service in McKean, or if you're joining us in Girard or Harbor Creek or watching online, I just want to say welcome to Grace Church. My name is Derek. I'm a pastor here, and I couldn't be more thrilled that you've taken the time today to invest in your soul, the most important part of you. I know for some of you, it took a lot for you to take this step of coming to church today, and I just want to say I'm so proud of you for saying yes, and I've been praying that God would show himself to you in a very special way today. For some of you, he already has in worship, and so I just ask, would you open your heart to see what God might want to say to you? Well, I want to begin today with a question. The question is this: who has the right to label something? I heard a great treatment of this by Pastor Jason Mitchell, so I want to give him some credit here. But this is an important question in our era of hyper-labeling of everything and everyone. You saw all kinds of labels in last week's Super Bowl commercials. But who has the right to label something? Well, one answer is the person who made it. For example, if the Heinz Corporation made the ketchup, they have the right to slap the Heinz label on that bottle. You got dressed this morning and you put on a shirt with a label. If Tommy Hilfiger made that shirt, there's a Tommy Hilfiger label itching your neck right now. I can't take the label off and put my own label on there and make that the Derek Sanford clothing line without getting in a lot of trouble. Why? Because I didn't make it. But if you make something, you have the right to name it, to label it. But there's a second answer to the question, who has the right to label something? The second answer is, it's a person who purchased it. 5 or 6 years ago, if you lived in the Erie area, you could have gotten a U.S. Airways flight out of the Erie airport. You can't do that anymore. Why? Because in 2015, U.S. Air got bought out by American, and guess what happened? All those planes, all those employee uniforms, all those airport signs, they got relabeled because American purchased all the stuff. So they had the right to label it. Anybody ever buy a pet? You purchased your little puppy or kitty or turtle or python or whatever it is that you're into. You purchase that animal, and then the next thing you do is you name it, you label it. Now imagine that I came over to your house and I say, oh, what a cute little dog. What's your dog's name? And you say, oh, his name is the Notorious D.O.G. or whatever. Or you're like, I'd like you to meet my dog Captain Sniffer. Whatever ridiculous name you come up with. I can't just go, oh, that's a nice name. Come here, Charlie. Here, boy. Here, Charlie. I can't rename your dog because you paid for it, so you get to label it. So the one who has the right to label something is the one who made it and the one who purchased it. But shirts and pants and airlines and pets aren't the only things that carry labels. We carry labels too. Sometimes it's a label that you've given to yourself. Sometimes someone else gave it to you. I was in the 3rd grade and I had my first crush on a girl. It happened to be my teacher, Mrs. Beggs. She was the dreamiest thing I'd ever laid eyes on to date. Somewhere in my young mind, I thought that it would be a good idea on Thursdays when I stayed after school for Cub Scouts to write her some love notes. See, she was already gone for the day, and I had about a 20-minute window between when school ended and when Cub Scouts began, and so I would compose some pretty romantic notes. I would take them down to her empty room for her to find in the morning. Right now, my wife's saying, where are those romantic notes that you speak of? Anyway, apparently the word got out from Mrs. Beggs to some of my classmates that she was trying to find this Romeo that was leaving her notes. Well, one fateful day, I snuck into her room as usual, but as I snuck out, the most popular kid in school caught me, and he knew immediately that I was the love note writer. And I can remember it like it was yesterday, all the way down to his tone of voice, because he said it about 20 times, and then he repeated it in chant form through the whole Cub Scout meeting: loser, 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 loser. Now, up to that point, I didn't think I was a loser, but for years after, I wondered, because labels are powerful. Maybe you've taken on the label failure. You'd had enough business ventures, enough relationships have ended in failure that you've begun to wonder, well, maybe that's just what I am. Or maybe you're the stupid one, or maybe you've always been the smart one. Or maybe people tried to label you weak or ugly or needy, or you're the high maintenance friend, or fat or skinny or loud or quiet. Maybe you've been labeled the one who brings drama. You're the drama queen, or you're too sensitive. Or you're just difficult, maybe unlovable. Like you got rejected enough times by enough different people that you just concluded, I can't be loved. Sometimes it's a label you created and internalized, and sometimes someone gave it to you, like my popular 3rd grade friend. Maybe for you it was a parent or a coach or a boss or a coworker, but somewhere in there, you still carry that label. So let me ask you another question. Who has the right to label you? Because here's the thing, guys. The longer you live with a label, the more you accept it as true and it becomes a part of you. The longer you live with a label, the less it describes your past and the more it begins to determine your future. For example, if you carry the label of failure, like maybe you failed some tests at school, and then maybe your first couple of jobs you failed, and then you failed in a relationship or two, and pretty soon you just took it on. You said, I'm a failure. You received it and you started to believe it about yourself. Well, once that gets inside you, it won't be long until you'll stop trying new things. You'll stop taking risks. You'll stop stepping out in faith for God. Why? Because you're going to fail anyway, so why try? You've taken on the label. Or maybe you took on the label unloved or unwanted, like your parents didn't really show you love. You were always the loner in school. Maybe in adulthood you had a marriage or two not go well. And if you start carrying that unwanted label, you'll go in one of two directions. You'll either start pulling away from anything that resembles intimacy, or you'll start to pursue love in all the wrong ways. Or if you start internalizing the label that you're the loud one, you'll begin to silence your voice. You see, labels lock you in. And I want to come back to that, but first I want to go to our passage for the day. You can find it in Luke chapter 15. You can get there in your Bible or device if you want to follow along. It'll also be on the screen. We're going to start in verse 11, but as you're getting there, let me catch you up. So at the beginning of this chapter, Luke 15, we find out that Jesus is talking to the religious leaders of the day. And these guys loved labels. I mean, they would label whole groups of people as unclean, like we can't make physical contact with you, or sinners. We won't eat with you or associate with you in any way. In fact, at the beginning of this scene, these religious leaders are grumbling and gossiping among themselves because Jesus is eating with the wrong kind of people. He's eating with sinners. And so Jesus addresses them with these three famous stories. There's a story about a lost sheep and a lost coin and a lost boy. And Jesus is the master teacher. And he's going to start to bring into sharp focus the point of these stories. And here's the point, that every life matters to God. I'm going to give it away to you. But it's what I want you to see very plainly today, and I want to make it personal. Your life matters to God. And so he starts with a big number, a big scale. He first talks about 100 sheep. And then he's going to narrow it down. Next story, he talks about 10 coins. And then he's going to narrow it even further to the point where he's going to get us right to the heart of the story. He goes from 100 sheep to 10 coins to one son. And then he's going to apply another level to this. The first story is about an animal, just a sheep. Who cares a lot about those sheep, right? The second story is about what? It's about money. A little closer to our heart, money. And then the third story, real emotion comes into play. What does he talk about? A boy. So a sheep, and then money, and then a son. 100, 10, and 1. He's bearing in. He really wants the Pharisees to get it. He really wants us to get it. Because you see, in each of these three stories, there's some common elements. In all of them, something wound up missing. A sheep wound up missing. A coin wound up missing. A son wound up missing. And here's what I want you to see. In each story, the lost thing really mattered to someone. The lost sheep really mattered to the shepherd. Shepherds would actually know each sheep by name in those days. The lost coin, it was one of 10. The lady only had 10 coins. She was probably a widow, and so the woman had lost 1/10 of her estate. The coin really mattered to the woman. And the wayward son, he undoubtedly mattered to his father. Now watch. When something really matters to you and you lose it, you search for it. And so the shepherd leaves the 99 to search for the sheep. The woman turns her house upside down to search for the coin. The father scans the horizon every day to search for his son. That lost thing warranted an all-out search. Have you ever lost something really important to you? Your keys, your purse, your wallet, your wedding ring, your kid, Seriously, have you ever lost a kid? And that's a bad day. Some of you are like, oh my gosh, Pastor, I can't believe you lost a kid. If you've not lost a kid, here's why. You don't have a kid, okay? Because as soon as you have a kid, eventually you're going to lose that kid. It's a terrible feeling, but it happens. We lost a kid one time, and we didn't even know we'd lost him until the person returned him to us. He had decided to walk from our house to Grandma's house, and he'd made it all the way out of our neighborhood and was approaching the main road when a neighbor saw him and picked him up and brought him home, right? I won't mention which parent was responsible for him at the time, but boy, was she relieved when he came back. All right, so when something valuable gets lost, It warrants an all-out search. All of us have been there, right? So Jesus is dialing it in as he gets to the heart of the story of this lost son, because now he's focusing us on the true heart of God. The search of the Father shows that you, no matter who you are, no matter what kind of labels you carry, no matter what kind of outcast you feel like, that you are infinitely loved, infinitely valued. You are worth an all-out search. Here's the truth about you. You matter to God. So much that God has been searching you out since the day that you were born. Many of you are Christians, but every Christian that I know can look back and see all the steps that God orchestrated, all the ways that God was searching to bring you to himself. Maybe he put a positive influence in your life, or a book, or a Bible, or a church, and you look back by hindsight and you say, look what God did to bring me to himself. In fact, John 6:44, the Bible verse says, no one ends up in the kingdom unless they're drawn, because God in his love, he draws those whom he loves. Now, there are some of you here today who haven't stepped across the line of faith yet, and you should know right now that this very moment, that God may be tugging at you. He's saying, you're precious to me. You're in the right place. I'm drawing you to myself. I'm going to give you a chance to respond to that tugging on your heart before today is done, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's read the passage. It's in Luke chapter 15, starting in verse 11. And he said, there was a man who had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the share of property that is coming to me. And he divided his property between them. And so we have this kind of rebellious boy who comes to his father, and he does something very rude, frankly. He asks for his inheritance early. He's basically telling his father, I wish you were dead so I could have my inheritance. You see, the boy wants his father's stuff, but he doesn't want the father. In fact, that's a pretty good definition of sin. It's when we want God's stuff, but we don't want God. We say, yeah, I'll take the blessings of relationships. I'll take the blessings of good health. I'll take your beautiful creation. I'll take all the material blessings. I'll take all those things that come from you, God, but I don't want you. That's sin, and it's heartbreaking to God. And so the son asks for his inheritance, and the original listeners would have been shocked at what happens next, because the father actually gives it to him. He divided his property up. He let his son walk away with his share. And here's the first thing I want you to see today. That sometimes God lets you wander from home. He didn't want his son to leave home, but he allowed him to walk away. And some of you here, you're a child of God, but you've wandered from home. It doesn't mean that God doesn't love you. It doesn't mean that he doesn't want you back. It simply means that he's not a dictator. He allows you to make your own decision to walk away, to experience life without his rule and reign for a time. But look at what happens next for the boy in verse 13. It says, not many days later, the younger son gathered all that he had, and he took a journey into a far country, and there he squandered his property in reckless living. And when he had spent everything, a severe famine arose in that country, and he began to be in need. And so he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him into his fields to feed pigs. And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. And so the son's life of freedom started with a bang. It says he engaged in reckless living. The parties were good. The substances were flowing. New friends were everywhere. He was flush with cash, and life was good. And the best thing was he was away from dad, away from the rules of the house, away from the expectations. He had everything that money could buy. He was living a sinful lifestyle and having the time of his life. And I've heard preachers say, there's no enjoyment in sin. And I think, bro, you just must be doing it wrong, right? Because even the Bible says in Hebrews, there is pleasure in sin. Of course, it's enjoyable, or we wouldn't be drawn to it. But then there are 3 very important words that finish the verse in Hebrews. It says, for a season. There's pleasure in sin for a season. You see, it doesn't last. It leaves us empty. And so the boy discovered that sin begins with pleasure, but it ends in emptiness. And eventually his money ran out. Not only that, but there was a downturn in the economy so that he couldn't even find a respectable job. In fact, he had to take the lowest possible job that a devout Jewish boy could take. He was slopping pigs, these unclean animals. And things got so bad, he had reached such a low point that even the pigs' food started looking appetizing to him. The boy realized what some of you still need to hear and realize today. It's our second lesson from this story, that eventually sin will cost you everything. Some of you know this all too well. Maybe you've been left empty by regret and pain of a sexual sin. Maybe you're in a pigsty of broken relationships. Maybe you've lost the respect of your kids because of your sin. Maybe you're drowning in debt or financially scrambling. Maybe the darkness of a secret sin that no one knows is eating you alive inside. Listen, maybe you haven't reached your lowest point yet. Maybe you're just flirting with that sin. Maybe you're just starting down an emotional relationship with that person that's not your spouse. Or you're just starting to experiment with that substance. Or you're just starting to deal with your pain by overspending. Let me warn you now before you hit rock bottom. Sin will always take you further than you want to go, cost you more than you want to pay, and keep you longer than you want to stay. Eventually, it will cost you everything. And just imagine the labels that the boy was dealing with as he hunched over that pig trough that day. Failure. You're such a failure. You're so irresponsible, disappointing, unwanted, stupid, unforgivable. Guys, your sin would love to have the right to label you, but it doesn't. And so here's the boy at his lowest point in a faraway country, far from his father. Maybe you're here today and you're holding it together on the outside, but inside it's like you're in a faraway country too. You're away from God, away from your true self, away from who you know you were created to be. Some of you are like the boy, and options in your life that in reality are pig slop, they're actually starting to look good to you. And a moment of clarity needs to come for you. And that moment might be today. Because you have to ask, how long am I going to feed on this crap? Some of you have been feeding your ego your whole life. Aren't you tired of it yet? How many more positions? How much more status? How much more trying to make other people feel small with your comments? Well, what is it going to take to get you off that binge? Some of you have been feeding greed your whole life. But how many more cars? How many more deals? I mean, how much is enough? What are you feeding on? How many late night binges is it going to take for you to realize that addiction will never satisfy you? How many sexual exploits or conquests? How many rage attacks until you realize that anger isn't the answer? How long will you keep feeding stuff that will never satisfy you? Maybe you've thought about coming back to God, coming back to church. Maybe it's why you're here today. But you've been worried that you're too far gone, that maybe you'll be shamed instead of embraced. If that's you, check out this young man's next move. Look at verse 17. It says, but when he came to himself, that's important. When he came to himself, he said, how many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Here's a third thing I want you to see from this story today, that the way back to God begins with a decision. Every journey back to God starts with a decision. One day, the boy finally said, I'm turning this around. See, the first step to getting anywhere is to decide that you're not willing to stay where you are. He said, enough is enough. And listen, he didn't have to return to his father. He could have gone to his employer, the farmer, see if he could get a better position. He could have tracked down some of his old so-called friends who helped him to blow all his money. He could have pulled himself up by the bootstraps and said, I'm going to try one more time to make this thing work on my own. But the boy did the smart thing. He made the wise decision. He said, I have these regrets, and if I trace it back, this downward spiral started when I walked away from my loving father. And so if I'm ever going to get back to some healing, I need to go home to him. Can any of you relate? Can any of you trace back when things went south for you to when you removed God from your life? See, realizing that you're in a mess is important, but it's not enough. Then you have to make the decision to return home to your father. And so he started practicing his speech. I've sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. And then he does something important. Look at verse 20. It says, and he arose and came to his father. Now, look how his dad responds. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and before you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet, and bring the fattened calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to celebrate. Now, this is a very unusual ending for the original listeners. Here's how it should have ended to their ears. You see, there was a well-known ceremony that used to occur when any Middle Eastern son would lose a significant portion of the inheritance that he had received from his father. This usually happened after the father was dead, by the way, and in this case, the father was still alive. But if the son made some foolish business deals with his inheritance, or he gambled away cattle or land, and a considerable amount of the family estate was lost, the whole village would participate in what was called the shunning ceremony. And here's what it would look like. They would get clay vases, and they would fill them up with stones or corn nuts. And then they would march out to the place where that foolish son lived, and they would stand in his front yard, and they'd call him out of the house. And then one by one, these people from the village, they would raise up those clay vases above their heads, and they would walk up to that son, and they would smash them down on the doorstep of his home. And in effect, they were saying, you broke trust with your father, and you broke trust with your family that you should have been caring for. And by doing so, you broke trust with our whole community. And so now we formally break our relationship with you. And when the final vase was shattered, the whole village would ceremoniously turn their backs on that foolish son, and they would never have anything to do with him again. The guy would be cut off completely from community. It's a kind of a form of excommunication. The shunning ceremony is how this story should have ended in their tradition. But Jesus puts his own final twist on the story, doesn't he? Instead, it says when the son was still a long way off, the father sees his son coming. His son now emaciated from hunger and the effects of the party life he was living. And the father sprints to him, and he throws his arms around his son's wasted body, and he can't let go. He sees the face of his son, hardly recognizable, stained by sin and defeat and fatigue, and he starts kissing him. And the way that Jesus says this phrase, it can be translated that he kisses him over and over and over and over. He can't stop kissing his son. And for who knows how long, there are no words. There are just tears and embraces and kisses, just true love and forgiveness for his lost child. You see, by his actions, the father is sending out word loud and clear as he ran past all his neighbors' houses on the way to his son. No shunning ceremony for my boy. You put your vases away. This is my child. And friends, that's the heart of God toward you. Whoever you are, wherever you've been, whatever you've done, that's the heart of God toward you. You matter to God. You matter to God. God doesn't want you to live as a hired servant. He wants you as his beloved daughter or son. If you just come home to him, he longs to run to you and throw his arms around you and to kiss you over and over again and not let you go. That's the heart of God toward you. That's the moment that Jesus died to make possible. You see what the Father's doing here? When he's saying, bring the ring and get the banquet ready and get the robe and put it on him, he's relabeling his son. All those labels that sin tried to put on him, leaning over that pig trough, failure and loser and outcast and unforgivable and stupid and irresponsible. The Father's saying, no. Here's who you are. You are worthy. You are loved. You are valuable. You are forgiven. You are celebrated. You are my child. And that's the final lesson I want you to see today. Your true identity is determined by God. And ultimately, the boy had to decide which labels he was going to believe, which labels he was going to live out. And so do you. And I want so badly for you to be free of what the world labels you and what sin labels you. And that you would accept your worth and your value and your identity from God. I want to come back to the question that we began with. Who gets to label something? We said at the beginning that it's the one who made that thing or the one who purchased that thing. And I've got news for you. God did both for you. Ephesians 1:4 says, even before he made the world, God loved you, and he chose you in Christ. You were made by God. And then just a couple verses later in Ephesians 1:7, the Bible says, God is so rich in kindness and grace that he purchased our freedom with the blood of his son, and he forgave our sins. Who has the right to label you? Your boss? No. Your jealous coworker? Nope. Your parents, your friends, your pastor? No, no, no. Only the one who made you and who purchased you. You see, when you choose to live your life under the loving care of your Father, your primary identity is as his beloved son or daughter. You are perfectly safe in his hands. But then there's this other way that you can do life. In the language of this story, it's to live in a distant country, to be far from the Father. When I'm in a distant country, I don't think often of God. I don't want to be reminded of him because then I might feel guilty for some of the choices I'm making. When I'm in a distant country, I find sins like deceiving someone or gossiping are increasingly attractive. When I'm in a distant country away from God, I don't have that inner sense of freedom and life. I feel weighted down because I know something is off in me. When I'm in a distant country, I feel hurried and rushed and easily irritated and easily threatened. I may search for bursts of pleasure, but I don't have a sustained joy. All of us choose at some time or another, will we come home to the Father or will we live in that distant country? And I ask, where are you today? And I want to invite you, if you're in a distant country, to come home. Because here's the promise. Here's the other crazy part of all three of these lost stories. When the lost thing is found, there's great rejoicing. When the shepherd finds the lost sheep, he's delighted. When the woman finds her lost coin, she calls all her friends rejoicing. And when the lost son is found, you notice how this ended. The father throws this huge party to end them all. The retrieval brings rejoicing, and Jesus is clear to point out as he tells these parables what this means. He says, there is great rejoicing in heaven over even one sinner who repents. Do you know what that means? It means that when you turn back from your distant country and you come home to the loving Father and you let him relabel you, when you surrender your life back to him, when you come back to church after a long absence, that you're not met with condemnation. You're not met with judgment. You're not met with blame or accusations or disapproval. You're met with rejoicing. If you've already taken this step to give your life to Christ, isn't it wild to think about that the day that you were saved, all of heaven from one end to the other, all of the saints that have died and gone there before you, all the legions of angels across heaven, and God himself, they threw a great big party, and the banner over the head table had your name on it. It had my name on it. Whenever I picture that in my mind's eye, I cry like a baby. There's no way that I could ever matter that much to anybody. I've never known a love like that. I didn't think one existed. That all of heaven would stop and throw a party for a screw-up like me. My name is on that banner. And it melts me every time. And if you're here today, and it's time to come home to God, it's time to push away from the slop you've been feeding on. Remember, the way back to God begins with a decision. And if that's you today, and you take that step today, the name on the banner over the head table in heaven is going to be your name. And we in this room, we will join heaven with you in celebration. And so we're going to provide you an opportunity to respond in just a moment. But before then, will you just close up anything that you have open in your lap right now, devices, bulletins, whatever. We're going to just take a moment or two to reflect and respond. And I would just ask you to quiet yourself. Listen for the voice of God. The Spirit of God is here. He is moving. He is active. He is speaking and prompting and urging and drawing you to himself. So would you take a moment now and listen for his voice? And then your host is going to come and give you an opportunity to respond in salvation. God bless you guys.